Let's talk about personality. It's how we see ourselves, right? How we connect with people, how we make our way through the world. But what happens when that very foundation becomes a source of constant daily struggle? Today, we're diving deep into personality disorders. These are really complex conditions that touch every part of a person's life, from their inner world to how they get by at work. So let me just ask you this. What if a condition that can throw a wrench into someone's job, their relationships, even how they see themselves? What if that wasn't some rare textbook diagnosis, but something that's actually all around us, kind of hiding in plain sight?
Because the reality is, it is far from rare. A huge analysis of studies found that about 10.6% of people have a personality disorder. Think about that for a second. That's more than 1 in 10 people. That number is it's staggering. And it's exactly why we need to be talking about this.
Okay, so with a number that big, we have to make sure we're all on the same page. Let's get the basics down first. What exactly are we talking about when we say personality disorder?
Right, so the key words here are pervasive and enduring. This isn't just about being a little quirky or having a bad day. We're talking about a long-term pattern that's really inflexible. It shows up everywhere, at work, in friendships, in how a person sees themselves, and, this is crucial, it causes real distress or makes it genuinely hard to function.
For the longest time, the way we tried to make sense of this was by sorting them into 3 clusters. You had cluster A for behaviors that seemed kind of odd or eccentric, then cluster B for the more dramatic or emotional patterns, and finally, cluster C, which was all about anxious or fearful traits. It was a simple way to file things away, but it turns out it was a little too simple. Yeah, that old cluster system, it had some pretty big problems. It was way too complicated in some ways, and honestly, the data didn't always back it up. So that's led to this huge paradigm shift in how experts think about and diagnose these conditions, and that's really the heart of what we're digging into today. And the difference is just night and day. The old way was all about trying to cram people into these rigid, separate boxes. The problem was, people don't fit neatly into boxes. You'd have someone who met the criteria for several disorders at once. It got so messy that a lot of clinicians just stopped using it. The new model from the ICD-11 completely flips the script. It asks 2 basic questions. First, how severe is the problem? And second, what specific personality traits are we seeing? It's so much simpler, it's backed by better evidence, and it's way more helpful in the real world. So this is what that new approach looks like. It's a really clear 3-step process. First, you figure out what the core issues are, with their sense of self and how they relate to other people. Step 2, you gauge the severity. Is it mild, moderate, or severe? And then finally, you use a set of key traits to basically paint a more detailed picture of that person's specific challenges. So what are these traits? The new model gives us these 5 main areas to build that picture. You've got negative affectivity, which is basically the tendency to feel a lot of negative emotions. Detachment, which is that feeling of being withdrawn, both emotionally and socially. Dissociality means a disregard for other people's rights and feelings. Then there's anancastia. It's a clinical term, but it basically means rigid perfectionism and needing to be in control. And finally, disinhibition, which is all about acting impulsively. Using these traits just gives you a much richer, more accurate understanding of what someone's going through. Okay, so we have this new way of understanding things clinically. But what does it all mean out there in the real world? Let's connect the dots between the diagnosis and a place where these challenges can become incredibly obvious, our work lives. Those core difficulties with relationships can create this massive ripple effect at work. We're talking about everything from being absent more often and having constant friction with coworkers and bosses to just struggling with job performance. And that can easily spiral into this cycle of job hopping and instability, making it almost impossible to build a stable career. And the numbers, they really tell the story here. Having a personality disorder is linked to a 20% higher likelihood of being unemployed for a long period of time. This isn't some small thing. It has huge consequences for people's lives, both personally and financially. So what's really at the root of these problems at work? This quote just hits the nail on the head. It's not usually about a lack of skill or not wanting to work. The main driver is the interpersonal stuff. A whopping 79% of people with these disorders say their stress at work comes directly from problems with their coworkers and bosses. And then, layered on top of all of that, is this incredible weight of social stigma. These misconceptions that people with personality disorders are dangerous or manipulative. It just creates this environment of fear and isolation.
And it's so unfair because the reality is that these individuals are far, far more likely to harm themselves than anyone else. All right, so we've laid out the challenges pretty clearly. The big question is, where do we go from here? Let's shift gears and stop focusing on just the problem. Let's talk about solutions, about the strategies that can actually build a path to better outcomes.
Now, you might think the first line of defense would be medication, right? But what's kind of shocking is that for personality disorders, the research is really, really limited, especially for those in that old, odd, or eccentric cluster. There are literally no FDA-approved drugs specifically for these conditions. A lot of what's done is based more on theory than on hard evidence from clinical trials.
So if medication isn't a clear-cut answer, what is? Well, there are these amazing, effective strategies out there, like something called the Individual Placement and Support Model, or IPS. It's such a brilliant idea, it combines mental health support directly with vocational help to find a job, and the results are seriously promising. The data shows that almost 36% of participants with a personality disorder were able to get a competitive job. That's a huge win, and it just proves that when you have the right kind of support, good outcomes are absolutely possible.
And that really shows us that support isn't just about what happens in a therapist's office. The workplace itself is a massive piece of the puzzle. Companies can make a huge difference with some really concrete steps. Encouraging open and safe communication, offering flexible work options, making sure people have access to mental health resources, and, this one's so important, actually training people to reduce stigma and build real understanding.
And that kind of brings us to our final thought here. We've seen how work can sometimes make the challenges of a personality disorder even worse. But now, with a newer, better way of understanding these conditions and a real commitment to support that actually works, we have to ask a different question. Could the workplace transform itself from being part of the problem into being a vital part of the solution?